Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something that I think a lot of us have thought about, maybe even dreamed about. How to speak English like a native speaker.
Right.
That kind of effortless flow that just sounds so natural.
It's a goal for so many English learners.
It really is. And to help us break this down, we've been really digging into a fascinating podcast episode from SS Express Media. RJ Nirob and Jotti, the hosts, had a really insightful conversation about the challenges and some practical techniques.
Yeah, they had some great points, very actionable advice.
Right. So our mission today is to pull out those golden nuggets for you. We want to explore why speaking like a native speaker can feel so difficult, and then give you concrete steps that you can actually use to start sounding more natural, more like, well, you belong.
Sounds good.
Okay, so first things first, why is this even a struggle? I mean, people study English for years, they learn grammar, they build up their vocabulary, but then actually speaking, it can still feel like clunky, right?
Absolutely. Nirob and Jotti actually highlighted that right off the bat. One of the biggest barriers is just the fear of making mistakes.
Oh, yeah, that fear is real.
It is. It's like there's this pressure to be perfect immediately, which, ironically, makes you less likely to practice and improve.
So true. You get stuck in your head, worried about saying the wrong thing, and then you don't speak at all.
Exactly. And they also pointed out how the English we learn in textbooks can be so different from how native speakers actually talk.
Oh my gosh, yes. It's like learning the waltz and then being thrown into a mosh pit.
A perfect analogy. Textbooks give us this structured, formal version of the language, but real spoken English is so much more fluid. It has all these shortcuts, these unwritten rules.
Right, and that leads to another big challenge. Pronunciation. English pronunciation can be so tricky.
It really can be a minefield. You think you've got a word down, and then a native speaker says it, and you're like, wait, is that even the same word?
It's like English has this secret code when it comes to pronunciation, and no one gave us the key.
And the funny thing is, Nirob and Jotti emphasized it's not just about individual sounds. A huge part of sounding natural is the rhythm and intonation of your speech.
The music of the language, basically.
Exactly. Native speakers use a kind of musicality when they talk. It's the rise and fall of your voice where you place emphasis in a sentence. Like if you say, I'm going home, with a rising intonation, it sounds like a question, even though the words themselves are a statement.
Wow, that's such a good point. I never thought about it like that, but it makes so much sense. It's like you can play all the right notes on an instrument, but if the rhythm is off, the song just doesn't sound right.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the big obstacles. Now let's get to the good stuff. Solutions. What did Nirob and Jotti suggest we can actually do to start unlocking that more natural, native-like way of speaking?
Well, their first piece of advice, and this is really fundamental in language learning, is to just immerse yourself in listening to native speakers as much as possible. They specifically mention movies, TV shows, and YouTube videos as great resources.
So basically, surround yourself with English as much as you can.
Yes, but the key here, they stressed, is how you listen. It's not just passive listening, it's about actively paying attention to the way native speakers use stress and pauses in their speech.
So it's like you're tuning your ear to the rhythm of the language. You're not just listening to the words themselves, you're listening to how they're delivered.
Exactly. And then they introduce a technique that I found really interesting, shadowing.
Shadowing. Tell me more about that.
So shadowing is basically real-time imitation. You listen to a sentence or a phrase from a native speaker, and you try to repeat it at the same time, matching their speed, their tone, their pronunciation as closely as you can.
Oh, wow. So you're kind of like their echo.
In a way, yes. It forces your mouth and your ears to work together in a completely new way. Jotti even described it as copying a native speaker's voice as if you are acting in a movie.
I love that. It's like you're embodying the way they speak. That must be really effective for training your pronunciation in your ear for the subtle nuances of the language.
It really is. It makes you pay attention to all those little details we talked about. The rhythm, the intonation, even those tiny variations in pronunciation that we often miss.
Okay, that's fascinating. So we've got immersive listening and this shadowing technique. What else did they suggest?
Well, then Nirob and Jotti talked about the importance of connected speech. And this is where things get really interesting in terms of sounding natural.
Connected speech. I think I've heard of that, but remind me what that means exactly.
So connected speech is basically how words change when we speak naturally and quickly. It's about the way sounds blend together, the way we use contractions, and all those little shortcuts that native speakers use without even thinking.
Oh, right. Like saying, what you doing instead of what are you doing?
Exactly. Or gonna instead of going to, and wanna instead of want to. These are all examples of connected speech.
And these small changes, they really do make a big difference in how natural your English sounds, don't they?
They absolutely do. It's like the difference between playing individual notes on a piano and playing a smooth, flowing melody.
It's that smoothness, that effortless flow that really makes someone sound like a native speaker. It's almost like there's this unspoken understanding of how to connect the sounds.
Exactly. And Nirob and Jotti stressed that learning to recognize and then use these connected speech patterns can really take your fluency to the next level. It's about moving beyond pronouncing each word individually and starting to think about how words flow together in natural speech.
Okay, so we have immersive listening, shadowing, and connected speech. What about the mental game? That nervousness that can creep in when you actually have to speak. Did they address that at all?
They did, and they had some really helpful advice for building confidence and making practice a regular habit. Their first point was so important. Allow yourself to make mistakes.
Oh, that is so important. It's so easy to get caught up in being perfect.
It is. But Jotti pointed out that even native English speakers mess up sometimes. They stumble over their words, they make mistakes. The key is to just keep speaking, even if you're not perfect.
It's like you have to embrace the messiness of the learning process. You're not going to sound perfect right away, and that's okay.
Exactly. And they also had some really practical tips for getting that speaking practice in, even if you're not constantly surrounded by native speakers. They suggested things like talking to yourself in the mirror.
I actually do that sometimes. It does feel a bit strange, but it does help.
It does. It's a low-pressure environment where you can practice forming sentences and getting comfortable with the physical act of speaking. They also suggested joining English-speaking groups, either online or in person.
That's a great idea. It gives you a chance to interact with other people and use your English in a real-world setting.
Exactly. And they had another suggestion that I thought was particularly helpful, recording yourself speaking.
Oh yeah, that can be a bit scary, can't it? Hearing your own voice.
It can be, but it's also really useful. It allows you to listen to yourself objectively and pinpoint areas where your pronunciation might be different from a native speaker or where you could incorporate more connected speech.
It's like getting feedback from your own ears.
Right. And then Nirob and Jotti touched on a really important point. Trying to think in English.
Ah, that's a big one, isn't it? Letting go of that translation process in your head.
It is. But they explained that when you're constantly translating from your first language to English, it actually slows you down and makes your speech less fluid. If you can start thinking directly in English, you'll naturally speak more quickly and confidently.
It's like you're removing that extra step, that mental hurdle. You're allowing your thoughts to flow directly into English.
Exactly. And finally, they emphasize something that's so easy to forget in the midst of all the hard work of language learning. Having fun.
Oh, that's so important.
It is. They said that the more you enjoy the learning process, the more motivated you'll be and the faster you'll improve.
It makes sense. When something feels like a chore, it's much harder to stick with it.
Absolutely. So just to recap the main takeaways from RJ Nirob and Jotti's conversation, we explored why speaking like a native English speaker can be challenging. The fear of making mistakes, the difference between textbook English and real-world English, the complexities of pronunciation, rhythm, and intonation. But we also learned about some really practical solutions. Listening to native speakers, using shadowing, mastering connected speech, practicing regularly and without fear, thinking in English, and most importantly, enjoying the process.
That's a great summary. And it's so important to remember, as they emphasized, that mistakes are a natural part of learning. Every mistake is an opportunity to improve.
Absolutely. So as you're listening to this, think about which of these techniques resonates with you the most. Which one could you start implementing today?
Yeah, maybe try focusing on the music of English, the rhythm and intonation, instead of just the words themselves. It could really open up a whole new level of fluency for you. It's all about those subtle nuances that really make a difference.
Exactly. Pay attention to how native speakers use their voices and try to imitate them. You might be surprised by how much progress you can make.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found RJ Nirob and Jotti's insights as helpful as we did. Until next time, keep exploring, keep practicing, and most importantly, keep having fun with English.